سامي مرعي.
أهلا وسهلا أستاذ سامي. اليوم في عنا لقاء مع السيناتور ريتشارد بلاك، شو بتتوقع؟
نحن بهذا المقترب بنجتمع على أساس أنه كل شيء بينفع بلدنا، ومثل ما بنقول أنه في شيء مصلحة لسوريا، ومصلحة سوريا فوق كل المصالح، فلذلك نسمع، نتثقف، نتعلم، بنشوف شو اللي بيساعد وطننا، وعلى أساسه إن شاء الله بجيب السلام للوطن وللأهل.
Thank you very much. Stay standing. Stay standing. Moment of silence for the fallen victims of all violence, starting with 9/11 to all the victims fallen in Syria. Thank you very much for everybody that made it today. And obviously we thank the Left Forum and the Schiller Institute for being with us. They are always associated with us and we work beautiful work together. We at SAF, we see all the suffering that is happening in our beloved Syria, and we're happy to see that a lot of people are gathered to try to do something about it. We at SAF believe that the problem in Syria should be solved only through dialogue, should not be solved through killing. Killing is not going to help anybody. We believe that dialogue is the key and the way to get peace back to Syria. We're very happy to have our astute friend and guest, Senator Black with us, Senator Richard Black, a state senator from the state of Virginia, that was made famous by his positions about what's happening in Syria and by his trip to our beloved Syria. We try to jump over the media and over all the attended people that get us the information to frame things as if it is a search for democracy or people are trying to make it peaceful. It is for real a war against Syria because the United States first and the world second are trying to change the regime in Syria to have a government that is friendly with Israel. We don't talk about politics in here, we only say that it's a shame that the Syrian public are being killed for political purposes, and this is why we're doing what we're doing, so we can stop that happening. We try to associate with all the friends that can work with us, and we try to make it as quick and as mass as possible, so we can have our voice heard everywhere to hopefully get peace towards Syria. Now we have a forum, it is called the Syrian American Forum, and we have a forum in here. We're going to open questions to the public, but please, when Senator Black is going to give us his talk, defer your questions to the end of the talk, give him the chance. He's well equipped and he knows what he's talking about. He visited Syria, and I saw one of his talks. He's pretty eloquent. Let him finish, and then it will be an open time for questioning any question you like. Nobody is going to try to change the question or the answer. The only thing we ask is to be civil about it. If we disagree with anybody, we stay civil about it. I could interfere to make the civility stick. We need to respect each other, definitely, even if we can disagree with each other. Senator Black, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. The reason that I am involved in this at all is that I think that the United States is on a disastrous course, one that risks not only all of the civilization of the Middle East, but also the future of all of the civilized world. I have recently returned from Syria, and I want to thank Mr. Paul Jallow, who made it possible at the last moment to go over, who accompanied me. He's got very major business interests. He dropped everything, and he helped me. I'm not an Arabic speaker, and so he was very good at facilitating the visit over there. So with that, let me begin. I apologize for the technical problem, but I'm not an anti-war activist or anything of that sort. I was was a Marine Corps pilot in Vietnam. I flew 269 combat missions, came back with bullet holes in the plane 4 times. I also fought on the ground with the 1st Marine Regiment, and 10 minutes after this photo was taken, I was aboard this assault raft, and we were trying to rescue an outpost of Marines who had been surrounded by communist forces. 10 minutes after that photo was taken, almost everyone on that raft was dead or wounded. I was wounded, both of my radio men were killed beside me. I went back to law school. I went on, I completed a career in the Army JAG Corps, and I ended up in the Pentagon, where I was a division chief on the Army General Staff, and I advised the Senate Armed Services Committee. I testified before Congress on various occasions, and my division was responsible for preparing executive orders for the President's signature. So I've come from this as an American who is very patriotic, but at the same time very deeply concerned with the error in American policy that I see taking place. In April of this year, I went to Syria at the invitation of the President, and they were most gracious in hosting me. When I returned, I was asked by the Washington Post, they said, well, what did you learn? And of course, they're always looking for some naive politician who goes over and who comes back, and he's like George Romney, who went overseas and came back, and then he said, oh, I was brainwashed while I was there. Well, what I told the Washington Post, which I think accurately summarizes it, is that I did not learn any major thing new, but that the visit took Syria from black and white to technicolor for me. And it brought everything to light. And of course, as most of you know, it's a very beautiful place, very beautiful culture, and I was able to experience it. Spent 2 hours with the President. In the midst of our conversation, I told him that I regretted that I would not be seeing the First Lady, Asma Assad, and several minutes later, she popped into the room and joined us. She has got to be the finest First Lady on the face of the earth. Gorgeous. You know, I tried to find a photo that would capture her. She dressed much more simply than this, but there's a sort of radiant glow about her that I can't explain it. I have to ask you to accept that it is incredible. While Bashar al-Assad, he's a soft-spoken, gentle man who he's very bright, very cautious in his speech. He's a medical doctor, an ophthalmologist, and never had an interest in being a politician at all. He wanted to be a doctor, and interestingly, his wife never wanted to marry a doctor. She swore, her father was a cardiologist, she said, I swore that I never would be married to a doctor, and then I met Bashar, we fell in love, and you genuinely could sense the chemistry between the two of them. They are very deeply in love, and so when they came to Syria, of course, Bashar al-Assad's brother was killed in an accident. He was the heir apparent, and so President Assad was essentially drafted. This was not something that he sought after, but he and his wife, they generated this tremendous excitement between themselves about the ability. They were very westernized, by the way. She did not grow up in Syria. She grew up in London, and President Assad was practicing medicine in London, and so they began to become very excited about this. They wanted to bring reform. They wanted to root out corruption. They wanted to modernize the country, and they began doing so with great success. Now, before we go on, I want to get something out of the way that is a major concern. You have heard and read 1,000 times that Bashar al-Assad gassed his own people. He crossed the red line, and why didn't we go in, and why didn't we just bomb Syria into oblivion and destroy it? Because they use gas on their own people. Now, it's amazing how quickly the media picked up this narrative, because there was nothing rational supporting it. At the time that the Ghouta gas attacks occurred in Damascus, Syria was fighting very desperate battles on perhaps 5 fronts. If President Assad were willing to draw the United States into war against Syria by releasing gas, certainly he would have done it against enemy troops instead of firing it on his own capital city on civilians. The whole notion was so preposterous that it was amazing that the intelligence agencies were able to sell this to the public. But it just shows that if you repeat a lie frequently enough with enough hysteria, you can get people to accept it. I wanted to show you this timeline. Timelines tell us a great deal about what goes on. I'm a former prosecutor, and so I often link things together, and you discover facts by this. This is a very brief timeline because it only goes from May 30th to August 31st, and just a couple days beyond. On May the 30th, the Turkish authorities, back before Turkey had become entirely tyrannical, the Turkish authorities did a raid on 13 al-Qaeda homes in southern Turkey. They did this based on very extensive wiretaps that showed that al-Qaeda was obtaining sarin gas, that they had brought the materials in from Western Europe, that they had developed a major capacity to produce it. They had plans to take it across the border into Syria and take it on to Damascus. They had obtained rockets to fire this, and they were going to fire the gas in Damascus. Now, this was all revealed. It's actually in the press, and I picked up on it because I do what you call open source intelligence, which is just the reading of vast numbers of articles from pro-Syria, anti-Syria, Asian, African, every place in the world, and you synthesize it and you discover things. But there are a number of articles that disclose this discovery. The Turkish authorities seized 2.2 kilograms of sarin gas in the raids. They brought indictments against those people, and then suddenly the prosecutor was taken out of the case, he was replaced, and all the charges were dismissed, and these individuals went across the border into Syria and disappeared. So this happens on May the 30th. Now, 3 weeks later, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which works directly under the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Pentagon, issued a report. Their report said al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, and you'll hear me, I'll refer to them as al-Qaeda because I'm not into this scrambled eggs of all of these different names. Al-Qaeda is al-Qaeda. But anyway, the DIA report said that al-Qaeda has a major sarin production unit. We're not talking about small amounts, we're talking about very large amounts. On August the 13th, something most unusual happens. The various terrorist groups called together a meeting with NATO representatives at a base in Turkey. And they announced that there would be imminently a war-changing development and that the United States would bomb Syria. What do you think about this? The rebels were telling all of these representatives that the United States of America was going to bomb Syria. Now, the gas attack hadn't occurred. There had been no hint of a gas attack. And yet, somehow the rebels knew what members of the American Congress, senators, did not know, that the United States was going to bomb Syria. Interesting. What they said is, this is going to happen. They obviously were most convincing because they said we need an immediate release of a huge amount of weapons so that we can launch the final drive on Damascus. This is incredible because right at that point the forces were stalemated all over the country. How could the rebels, the Al-Qaeda-linked rebels, predict that they were going to make the final drive on Damascus when they were stalemated? The United States held vast sums of weapons in Turkey under CIA control, very tightly controlled. And beginning then, you know, it takes time to gear up things, to get trucks, to get all of the things, but they immediately acted on it. August the 21st, the Ghouta gas attack occurs. And between August the 21st and the 23rd, 1,000 tons of advanced weapons were transported across the Turkish border into Syria for the final drive on Damascus. If this doesn't convince you that this whole thing was an absolute fabrication and a setup, then there's probably no hope. But I'm going to tell you as a former prosecutor, when I look at that, I'm not looking at Bashar al-Assad as the criminal. I'm looking at somebody else as the criminal, and we'll get into that more. Okay, Syria. Before the war, one of the issues that you'll see, Turkey runs across the northern border of Syria and of Iraq. At the time, before the war began, Syria was ranked as one of the 5 safest nations on the face of the earth. Incredible. Here it is. There were no kidnappings, there were no bombings. People could travel in complete safety. They had the greatest religious freedom of any Arab nation. They had women's equality. Women could marry who they wanted, they could travel where they wanted, they could attend school, which, by the way, was at government expense. They could go as high as they wanted. There were women, well, I tell you, just recently, they elected a woman, a Sunni woman, as the Speaker of the Syrian parliament. The closest political advisor to Bashar al-Assad is a woman, Butena. And so women did everything in Syria. And so you would think that this would be the model that we would want to promote throughout the Arab world. Now, again, timelines. This is very interesting. You have been told over and over again that the Syrian war began because of the Arab Spring. People came out, they demonstrated. Bashar al-Assad was too tough. Next thing, he is killing people, and so we have a revolution. When did the war actually begin? Now, the outbreak of war in Syria was in 2011. So when did it actually begin? 10 years earlier. Now this is undeniable. The Pentagon began war planning to topple Syria in 2001. We know this because General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, told us so, and he's on videotape, and you can see it, and he said that he visited with the Secretary of Defense right after 9/11, and then he met with a general in the war room who confided in him. He said, you know what? He said, we have plans, or we've been directed to draft plans to topple 7 countries in the Arab world within the next 5 years. And Wesley Clark said, well, why? What's going on? No answer, really. Now, 5 years later, the next significant action comes to light. Now, of course, things are happening all through. We know some of them we don't, but this is important. In 2006, the United States Embassy in Damascus issued an extensive paper detailing plans to topple the government of Syria. And at the time, Syria was totally at peace. It had had peace with Israel for 40 years on the border. It had withdrawn the forces that had been in Lebanon for some time. And yet here we are, and the embassy is saying, we're going to overthrow the government. We know this because WikiLeaks released the document. So we have the document. Now, two things jumped out at me when I read the document. And the terms that I use are not as smooth and subtle as the diplomatic language that's used in the document. But this is what jumped out at me. Number one, it said, Bashar al-Assad is perceived as being a reformer, and it has drawn a tremendous amount of direct foreign investment into Syria. This is a problem because the economy is booming, and we must smear the reputation of Syria so that we can undermine this economic success. The other thing that it said that I think was much more sinister, they said, we have to create religious divisions and hatreds between various factions, particularly the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Christians, the Alawites. And these are proposals of my government. And I am not proud that these are proposals of my government, but we know them to be a fact, and those can't be refuted because we have the original source documents. Now, I want to show you there's a connection between Libya and Syria. 2011, by then, Hillary Clinton is in office. She has put her man in as the director of CIA, Leon Panetta, and plans began. The Arab Spring occurs. Anybody, I have no proof of this, but anybody who tells you that the Arab Spring just swept across the Arab world because one man committed suicide, listen, tonight somebody out in town is going to commit suicide, and the United States is not going to be swept by all sorts of uprisings. So I cannot believe that the Arab Spring was anything other than a very massive, well-coordinated covert action. But here's what we do know. The Libyan uprising began in February 2011. There's a long story associated with it. I won't go into that, but the CIA and MI6 were very instrumental in generating this. And one of the things that occurred in Benghazi, which also was repeated later in various cities in Syria, is that you would have snipers. The Muslim Brotherhood is very instrumental. This is a technique that's used over and over. You put snipers up, and when you have demonstrators, as you did, you had some legitimate demonstrators. The snipers shoot a demonstrator. Then they shoot a police officer, then a demonstrator, police officer. Before long, the police think the demonstrators have all opened up on them, and vice versa. And you take a peaceful demonstration, just like the demonstrations we have in this country, and you turn it into a riot and then a revolution. So the Libyan uprising is instigated, and Gaddafi sends a modest military force to restore order in Benghazi. And at that point, Senator John McCain goes to work. He's working with the State Department, and he says, oh my goodness, they're going to murder everybody. We've got to install a no-fly zone. That was done. Russia, I know President Putin forever will regret that he said that seemed reasonable. As soon as there was a no-fly zone, there was a free bombing campaign that absolutely obliterated Libya. Libya, which had been our #1 ally in the war on terror in North Africa. It was the most prosperous nation in North Africa, and today it doesn't even have a government. It's in utter chaos. Now look how quickly the time span is between the Libyan uprising and the Syrian war commencing. Just within a month, all of this happens. Now there's a link between the two, and we'll get to that. Okay, now what are the causes of the war in Syria? Now, you know, this is not the be-all and end-all, but I will tell you, first of all, this claim that it was a domestic uprising is absolutely false. Now, I ran into several people who were legitimate demonstrators, and one thing that I did learn that was a surprise to me, they said, yes, we demonstrated just like, you know, we had reforms we want. We didn't want to topple the government. But they said in very short order, people began showing up with Al-Qaeda flags. And then we said, get rid of them. This is not about that. We're trying to just bring about reform. And then they started showing up with automatic weapons. And you don't just buy automatic weapons at the drugstore in Syria. And they said, get rid of them. And then the next thing is they began to proselytize religious hatred and division. And this one fellow who was my interpreter, I was quite surprised when he told me he confided that he had been a demonstrator against the president that he worked for. And he said on the 7th month, his uncle, who had organized demonstrations across the entire city, was murdered by Al-Qaeda. And of the people that I ran into, I asked this question. I said, what was the length of time between when you had legitimate demonstrations and when it turned into Al-Qaeda-led uprising? And two of them said 1 month, and the other one said 2 months. So we're talking about almost no time at all. So this obviously was a very pre-planned thing, and I think there were a lot of innocent and well-meaning people who got caught up in it and then suffered the consequences. Okay, so there were two things. One is competing gas pipelines. There's a large oil field that spans Qatar and Iran. It's out in the Gulf there. And Qatar approached President Assad. They wanted to run a pipeline that would go across Saudi Arabia, across Syria, and into Turkey. Iran had competing ideas. They wanted a pipeline from Iran through Iraq into Syria, perhaps ending in Lebanon, where they might have done liquefied natural gas exports. President Assad refused the request of the Qataris, and immediately there began to be an enormous transfer of funds to the rebels who would later uprise. So that was one of the things. The other thing, and this one is of probably the greatest concern to Western powers, is the weaponization of religion. The type of Islam which is practiced by Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism, is extremely fundamental and extremely violent, and it has been exported around the globe. People have lived in peace, Muslims, Christians, various people, and with the Saudi Arabian movement to export and to turn religion into a weapon, which they have done very successfully. They, of course, having great money, they were able to convince Western politicians. The politicians met Mr. Green, and Mr. Green is very persuasive, and he is very wealthy, and Mr. Green has bought off many influential politicians. So the weaponization of religion it's a Pandora's box, and once you open it and the creatures begin to swarm out, getting them back in is a nightmare, which many of the NATO countries are now discovering as bombs are going off all across the world. Now here's just a graphic of the pipeline. This is the pipeline that Qatar wanted to run through Syria. This was the competing pipeline that the Syrians preferred, and that was one of the sources of the war. Now, the linkage to Libya. What started me in this whole thing is I watch foreign affairs all the time, and I've been involved in it in some capacity since I was a child. And I was curious, why are we attacking Libya? Libya hasn't done anything to us. It must be about oil. That's what we're doing. Well, there actually are several reasons, but for the United States, the principal reason is that it would take an enormous quantity of weapons to overthrow the government of Syria. And where do you get them? You can't go to Congress and say we need a huge appropriation because we're going to attack and we're going to overthrow the most advanced Arab nation, the one with the greatest religious freedom, the greatest women's rights, the greatest safety. And so please give us an appropriation so we can tear this country to pieces. So we couldn't do that, but they came up with a solution, and that was America's reason for going into Libya. Even before the Libyan government had fallen, NATO turned over a captured Libyan airfield to the Turks, and they operated it, and they began the rat line. And I hope someone has the handouts that I brought so that people can refer to this. They're in that manila folder. Okay, as long as we can give them out before we complete, perhaps before we start the question. There's a wonderful investigative journalist. His name is Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, published in the London Review of Books, widely published until he started revealing the truth about Syria, and all of a sudden doors started closing. Unfortunately, his works have been published. There's nothing that you need to refer to in this handout. Just fold it up and take it home, and it gives you something that you can look at in your spare time. And double check what I'm telling you. So what was the rat line? The rat line was the transfer of weapons from Libya into Syria. And it began with flights that came out of Qatar, which has significant aviation capability. They went in, they landed at the Turkish-held airfield in Libya. They were loaded up, and then the arms were transported to Turkey, and from Turkey they were sent across the border into Syria, where they were used to arm the rebels that were in Syria. Here's the big question. Who's going to win the war in Syria? I like that answer. Let's look at a couple of things. First of all, will it be the moderate rebels? A friend of mine, a woman who has this great love of Syria, just as I do, and she maintains a great network of contacts, not associated with the government at all. She said when she was over there, she asked a question I wish I had asked. She said to people, she said, if you could tell the American people something, what would it be? And repeatedly they would say, tell the Americans there are no moderate rebels. Tell them that we love Americans, but we hate what you're doing to our country. And I think that sums it up pretty well. Now, we don't just have to rely on the Syrian people for this, because in 2013, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff became so deeply concerned about the strategic ramifications of the potential collapse of Syria that he directed the Defense Intelligence Agency to do a complete scrub of the situation in Syria and to render formal findings of fact. There were three findings of fact. First, he said, the Defense Intelligence Agency said, first, Bashar al-Assad must not leave office because if he does, the nation will collapse in chaos, just as Libya did when Gaddafi was gone. That was number one. Number two, he said that Turkey is a major ally of ISIS. They are the country that is supplying the weapons. Weapons are pouring across the border, and this is a major problem. Third, they said there are no moderate rebels. They do not exist. It is a fantasy. So moderate rebels are not going to be the people who win the war, despite the fact the Secretary Kerry has said it so many times. The moderates are going to win. Those 5 guys that we trained, those 5 guys, they're going to take over. And I think they're all dead by now. But, so it's not going to be moderate rebels. Now, there are 2 other possibilities. It will either be the government led by President Assad, or it will be Al-Qaeda. Now keep in mind, this war is into its 6th year. In all of that time, not a single rebel leader has emerged as a popular figure with the Syrian people. Not one. This is incredible. At this time, the Syrian government probably has physical control over 75% of the population within Syria. And within those areas, people are confident, they're comfortable, they don't feel oppressed. But I'm going to tell you, in the other areas, unless you are part of the very radical Wahhabi movement, you are seriously oppressed. So it's going to be one of these two. Do we want it to be Al-Qaeda? That's the question. Al-Qaeda, which killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11, these are the people that the United States, through covert operatives, through so-called moderate rebels, are supporting. The American people don't know it. Most congressmen don't know it, but I'll tell you, more and more of them are beginning to understand it. Donald Trump understands it. And a woman named Kelly Ward, who is John McCain's opponent in the primary, understands it very clearly. So, are these the people? Is this what we want to be the future of Syria? Because if Al-Qaeda prevails, if Damascus falls and the dread black and white flag of Al-Qaeda flies above Damascus, this is the future of Syria. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about my trip to Syria. And we went to a number of places. I won't cover all of them, but one of the things that really stood out, I had heard about this very unique culture of religious harmony that existed before foreign powers imposed war and violence on a very peaceful nation. And this is the tradition of religious harmony. Now you're going to see me focus a lot on Christianity because the Christians make up about 10%, the Alawites make up about 10%. You have Druze, you have Shiites, the Sunnis are the majority. But the fact that the minorities are able to practice their religion not only freely, it's not that they're tolerated. Tolerance implies something bad that you put up with. It is harmony. There's a love among people that is just really remarkable. This is one of the greatest statues of Jesus Christ. It rises 105 feet over the mountains, and it's visible from from Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It was erected in 2013. It had been in the works for 8 years. The Russian Orthodox Church had been working and contributing, and finally they put it up in the midst of the war. I have difficulty imagining this being done in the United States today, but it's done freely in Syria. Now, we met with the Grand Mufti, and that's Paul Jallo to the left, who I just cannot say enough good about the things he's done to make this possible. This is the Grand Mufti, a delightful man. He is the top Sunni leader of Syria, and in the course of our conversations, he smiled and he said, we Syrians are 23 million Christians. He says, my mother's name was Miriam. Well, after a wonderful visit with him, we went on and we met with the Christian patriarch, and we had a delightful visit. Here he's presenting me with the Bible in Aramaic, the original language of Jesus Christ. There are many areas where people still speak Aramaic, where they study Aramaic, and he presented me with that. And in the course of our discussions, guess what he said? He said, in Syria, we are 23 million Muslims. And so I chuckled and I said, the Grand Mufti said essentially the reverse of this. And he said that his mother's name was Miriam. And then the patriarch stroked his beard. He said, he said, some people tell me that I have a Muslim beard. And I think it displays the warmth between people that existed, and just this beautiful harmony that I can't tell you of another country that I know of that comes anywhere close to it. Now, we went to Homs, and while we were at Homs, this is the governor of Homs right here, very, very fine individual, and I'm sitting over there next to his wife, and he had asked me, he said, you want to go to a choral presentation this evening? I said, sure, let's go. And this was during the religious season. It was Palm Sunday, and so I went in. He asked me to make some remarks to the crowd, and I did. They were very polite, and then I sat down, and the lights went down, and there was this very charismatic singer, and my eyes focused on her. Of course, I couldn't understand what she was saying. I don't speak Arabic, but she was. Yeah, you don't speak Arabic yet. I don't speak Arabic yet. but my heart is beginning to be Arabic, and so I'm watching her, and then my eyes drift to the orchestra, and then to the choral group, and then suddenly I'm stunned by this subdued image in the back of Jesus Christ with a crown of thorns, covered in blood. He's obviously been scourged, and he has the cross on his way to Calvary. And I leaned over to the governor's wife, and I said, "Am I in a religious or a Christian theater?" She said, "Oh no." She says, "This is a public theater. We just put on presentation." I said, "Well, I was surprised to see the theater screen with the image of Jesus Christ." She said, "Oh," she said, this is the holidays for the Christians." She said, "Many of the people in the audience are Muslims." And she said, "I know many of the choral members," and she said, "Many of them are Muslim." And she said, "This is just the way that we are in Syria." And it just struck me as amazing. And I encountered this repeatedly, time after time after time. I went towards the end of my visit. I was in Damascus, and I went and I gave an interview with the national broadcast system, SAF. And after we did that, I went out and I was shaking hands with the reporters, and then I looked over, and here's this Christmas tree. I said, what is this? I mean, it's obviously a Christian image. They said, this is the martyr's Christmas tree. And I went over and I looked closely, and it's a rather haunting tribute. These are journalists from Santa who were martyred covering the war. And it struck me, I thought, I've just been through this, the press kit where 70%, 80% of the people are Muslim, and I'm looking at a Christmas tree, and of the martyrs on the Christmas tree, I'm guessing that 70 or 80% of them are Muslim, and the Christians are paying homage to them and showing respect to them with the Christmas tree. I can't imagine this happening in the United States. If you did this at National Public Radio, people would run up and they would rip down and they would stomp and they would be cursing God's name, and they'd call in the ACLU and some federal judge would thunder about how impermissible it was to mix church and state. But there's harmony. And it's a harmony that I knew when I was a small child, and I've been around for a few years now, but we used to have this. We had this freedom of religion and this harmony. And I went to a school that had a lot of Jewish students, and we would pray the Lord's Prayer together, and we would talk about one another's holidays and so forth. And this goes on today in Syria. I wish that we could capture that spirit of Syria and bring it back and spread it in our country, because it is so superior to what we have. Now, we went out to Palmyra. One of the most satisfying victories of the war was the recapture of Palmyra. You cannot believe how difficult it was to seize the heights. The Syrian army, I cannot say enough good about them. I'm going to tell you, I fought with the 1st Marine Regiment. There are no better troops than the 1st Marine Regiment, and I know good troops when I see them. The Syrian army and their allies are the finest soldiers you will ever meet. And we're up on the ridge line overlooking Palmyra, and the generals are showing me how the attack was launched. And I've got to tell you, I've been in a lot of attacks, and the idea of going straight up a barren hill without any cover is amazing. And after they showed me all of the details of it, there I am with Paul Jallo and with the general who was in charge. And you'll see the castle that looms up there, the Palmyra Castle. That was the final outpost of ISIS. The last place to be seized. You can see there's very little damage because Syrians value history, they value culture, and so they rather suffer deaths than destroy civilization, something that their opponents love to do, which is to destroy civilization. In the attack, the deputy commanding general led the way all the way to the base of that castle, with ISIS shooting down with him in the wide open, and he was killed. I wonder how many American generals today, with the purge that's taken place over the last 8 years in the Department of Defense, I wonder how many American generals would lead their troops up a barren hill and look up at a castle and fight against people who have complete cover when you're in the open. Not too many, I'm afraid. Tremendous courage. They lined up some of the troops who had seized the line. This was the first time that I had inspected the troops since I retired at the old guard at Fort Myer years ago. And I've got to tell you that I was so impressed by each one, and I thought, you know, I fought in some of the bitterest combat that the Americans have ever seen, and what I did was nothing. what I did was trivial by comparison to what these men do as they fight year after year after year. We then went into the revetments. The Syrian forces had captured the airfield, and they now have it fully operational. This, I believe, is a MiG-23 jet, great aircraft, and one of the pilots is showing me. And then I spoke to them. I thanked them as I thanked all of the Syrian soldiers, not simply for protecting Syria, but for defending all of civilization. Now this is what was left. These are our opponents, the people that we want to put in power. Now it was ISIS, but you know, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, it's like drug cartels. They fight one another, but they all have the same objective, which is utter destruction. So what you're seeing here is what you would see with Al-Qaeda. They seized the main museum, they wrecked everything, they destroyed statuary. Do you know, there were 4,000 years of civilization preserved there. And for 4,000 years, no civilization that took over decided to destroy. It's quite amazing that it was the American-led coalition that stood by and watched and encouraged ISIS as they drove into Palmyra, for the first time destroyed 4,000 years of civilization, 2,000 years before Jesus Christ walked the earth. Incredible. And now, I had the great honor of shaking the hand of this man. His father, I believe it's pronounced Khalid Assad, and his father was the chief archaeologist at Palmyra for 40 years, and he decided he would stay there. He would try to convince the ISIS troops to preserve it. ISIS came in to loot and to ship the statuary to Turkey, and then to destroy everything that they couldn't sell. And so I shook this man's hand, and they told me, they said, this is the man whose father was tortured for a month, and then they said, if you don't reveal the location of the antiquities you've hidden, we'll behead you. And he said, I won't do it. And they beheaded him. And as I shook his hand, and he gave me a copy of his father's book, I looked at him and I said, you know, 1,000 years from now, when people come to visit Palmyra after it's rebuilt, they're going to speak of your father and how he defended the traces of civilization, the gems of civilization at Palmyra. Here we are standing where his father was beheaded. You can see war damage in the background, and we're talking about that situation there. His father's body was hung from a Roman column, and these are the people that we're supporting. Now we're bombing ISIS, okay. We're not bombing Al-Qaeda and all of their allies, but they're all the same people. They're all the same people. And here, I'm just pointing out the vast destruction. It's going to take 100 years to build Palmyra back, but if we have a civilized government, it will be rebuilt. If Al-Qaeda wins, then the remains will be gone, and Palmyra will simply become a dust bowl in the desert. I was so angered by this because I knew we have this tremendous American coalition with hundreds and hundreds of jets, and we knew that ISIS was coming across the desert. ISIS had to come with 1,000 vehicles, with tanks, with mobile artillery pieces, with all kinds of guns. And we stood aside because we thought, okay, if they can seize Palmyra, they can continue moving on. Maybe ISIS will take Damascus now for us. And so we did not do a thing to intervene and to save this UNESCO World Heritage Site and all of the evidence of human civilization that was preserved there. So badly did we want to topple Syria that we were willing to do that. And I think the expression on my face tells you what I was saying basically was, where was the coalition? Why did the coalition deliberately stand aside and allow the barbarians to enter Palmyra? From there, we were going out into Indian country, areas that were neither government nor ISIS controlled, but we had quite a convoy. I joked with them, I said, you know, we probably ought to just forge on and relieve the siege of Deir al-Zor. This was the truck that was in the lead, heavy cannon. This was one of the lighter cannons. Here are some of the fellows. We had some really rough and ready guys who were going out there with us. We had a column of about a dozen vehicles, and I was in a 4-ton bulletproof car. We had jet aircraft running protective runs on our right flank, and 4 assault helicopters on our left flank. So I was actually ready to go into the attack. I felt like I was back in old times again. Now this map is going to tell you something about the overall situation that was faced by the Syrians. The dark orange is the part that, roughly, the part that has been held by the government. Now, they have expanded since this map was made up. But I want to take your attention up to the Turkish border. If you see the area to the west of Kobani, you'll remember the very heroic battle of Kobani, where the Kurds held out and eventually it became a political embarrassment for the United States to where we actually had to go in and support them. And once they won the Battle of Kobani, they didn't stop, and they went and they recaptured the Kurdish occupied areas, which are shown in green along the Turkish border. But you'll see there is a gap. Now the gray areas are ISIS. And you'll notice not too far from Aleppo over to the east of Aleppo, you have this gap that the Kurds wanted to close. And they were beginning to threaten it very seriously. So the Turks, who had refused to join the coalition, for what it's worth, said, "Oh, we want to join the coalition. We're gonna bomb ISIS in this gap and make sure that we can drive them back." We agreed. We turned over that area to Turkey. They immediately did 300 airstrikes. 297 of the airstrikes were against the Kurds. They were all against the Kurds. That's all they cared about, is they wanted to keep the Aleppo gap open, because that has been the supply line for ISIS. Through that supply line, they got the loot from Palmyra. They got the loot from Aleppo, where Al-Qaeda had looted 1,000 factories. Aleppo is the industrial heartland of Syria. And they had a major oil trade. There were 2,000 oil tankers that were carrying oil not on back roads, but on super highways, crossing the border into Turkey. And so they wanted to preserve that. Now, interestingly, when the Russians went in, they were able, the Russians seemed to have better eyes than Americans. Because the Americans had never been able to discover these 2,000 tankers that were sitting out in the desert in the wide open. The Russians went in, and within 2 days they had destroyed 500 of them. The United States came in and claimed immediately that they had actually done it. When nobody believed that, then they came in and they said, well, the Russians really didn't destroy as many as they said. But anyway, it was really amazing. So in any event, the Russians knocked out 500. By the time that I was over there, they knocked out 1,500 of the oil tankers. And ISIS has had to cut all of their salaries in half as a result of that. Okay, now the big thing that is happening right now, I think many of you are aware, the Battle of Aleppo, for 4 years the Syrian government has desperately tried to close off the Aleppo pocket. You can see that the white areas there are controlled by Al-Qaeda and all of these alphabet soup groups, which really are subgroups of Al-Qaeda. And they could not do it, but in a series of very ingenious actions, they relieved the Khawarizm air base that had been under siege. Then they went north and they linked up with some Shiite areas, with Nubal and Zara, which is up at the very top there. And then, just within the last 10 days or so, they made advances on closing the gap. Now you can see where the Al-Qaeda supply line goes in, and this was the link that Al-Qaeda was using. And the Syrian army attacked finally across, and they finally succeeded, and they have closed off the pocket, and they have broken the supply line. And from what I can see now, on a very regular basis, the Syrian army is making significant advances against far less resistance. Some time back, within the last week, Al-Qaeda attempted a counterattack, an armored counterattack, and the Syrian army destroyed or captured a dozen armored vehicles, and now there's no way to replace them because the gap is closed off. This is a very encouraging sign. I want to talk to you just a minute. We, as part of this overall covert action to organize and orchestrate the Syrian war, we have created this alphabet soup that's incomprehensible. All of these names that sound very foreign to Americans, they change. Even ISIS. How many times have we changed the name of ISIS? ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, it goes on. But most of these groups, they just constantly swirl. Al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, has just changed its name. And but who are some of these people? Well, down in the Damascus area, Jaish al-Islam is one of the groups. We say these are not terrorists, these are moderates. And here they are with Alawite women in cages, and they're taking them around as human shields to prevent bombings. This is the way that Jaish al-Islam treats women, civilians. This is an incident that occurred shortly after I returned. This is the massacre at Al-Zara. Arar al-Sham is a group that the Syrians and the Russians had insisted during the peace talks that they be declared a terrorist group. And Secretary Kerry, the State Department, CIA said, no, these are moderate rebels, and we will not declare them to be terrorists. I have confirmation. Now, actually, Arar al-Sham did not deny this photo as being its own. They said that the housewives on the ground, that they were fighters. Right. They look like fighters, don't they? I am so appalled that we are supporting, the United States is supporting, funding, providing weapons, providing aid for these people. That fellow, look at him, he's got his boot on the back of a dead housewife. And your taxes and my taxes are paying for that pig who's standing there with his foot on the back of a dead woman. Now, you'll be happy to know that about a week later, his face appeared in a morgue, and so he did not last too long after that. I'm not sure whether he was hunted down or whether he was just killed in ordinary combat. Either way, he certainly got what he deserved. Here's another group. The United States, I want you to look at that little boy. That little boy was being treated for a blood disease in a hospital in Aleppo. And he is 12 years old, but he looks quite small. He looks like he's 8 or 9 years old because his growth is stunted because of the severe disease. He's very crippled, and they took him from the hospital. He still has the IV. You can actually see the IV, and it's still hanging out of his arm. He has some sort of a bag. I don't know whether it's for kidney function or bowel function. And so here's this frail, helpless little boy. And you've got 5 American-paid jihadists. Look at their faces. They're delighted. And we are paying their salaries. 1,000 of these men are being paid from this group by your taxes and my taxes. We're providing that group with TOW anti-tank missiles to use against the Syrian army, and we refuse to call them terrorists. A couple of minutes after this photo was taken, the man with his hand holding the hair of the boy took a knife and sliced his head off and waved his head up, yelling, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. Is this what America has come to be? Is this what we want to support? I'm telling you, one of 2 factions is going to win. Either President Assad, the government of Syria, is going to prevail, or these people are going to prevail. Now, this is one of our great heroes, Ambassador Al-Jafari, a wonderful fellow. One of the things that we try to do when we topple a country is we bribe the UN ambassador. We did it in Libya, and they attempted to bribe him, and he said, "No, I'm not going to betray my people. I'm not going to be the person to blame for slaughtering people in Syria." It's a great blessing that he represents the nation of Syria. He is truly one of the heroes of the war. Now, what can we do to end the war? Well, a lot's going to depend on what happens in the next elections. And I'm not here to talk politics, but I've got to tell you that there are differences. I've met the people who are advising Donald Trump, and they and I are totally in sync. I was amazed by the level of understanding and comprehension that they had. He seems to be heavily influenced by them. Huma Abedin, who has strong ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, is the closest advisor to Hillary Clinton. I think it's clear which side is going to benefit Syria. Now, I come at this as a nonpartisan. I'm going to tell you, Bernie Sanders was excellent on Syria. He was excellent on Syria. And there were some Republicans who were terrible on Syria. And in fact, I was helping one just so that I could move him. And I actually did move him in the right direction. Next week, I'm going to Arizona to campaign against a Republican, John McCain. John McCain is being opposed in the primary by Kelly Ward. She's a doctor. She understands Syria. I was really taken aback when we met with her at the Republican National Convention. She's running neck and neck with him. So Kelly Ward is her name, and if she does not win the primary, coin flip whether she will. If she doesn't, I will tell you, I hope that the Democrat wins that Senate seat, because there is probably no more bloodthirsty individual, no greater danger to world peace than Senator John McCain, a member of my own party. How would we end the war if we wanted to do it? The United States could end this war in no time at all. One of the first things we should do is end these American sanctions. We are blocking prosthetic devices, medical assistance, cancer drugs from getting into Syria. We should end the U.S. sanctions. We need to close U.S. terror training camps. We train terrorists in Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Now, we say that they're moderate rebels. We train them, we teach them how to use TOW anti-tank missiles and so forth, and then they go onto the open market. They go to the highest bidder. Many of the soldiers who fight for ISIS, there are interviews that indicate many of them came over after training with the United States. Same thing with Al-Qaeda. We need to close those terrorist training camps and stop fueling it. This is probably the biggest thing. When the Russians went in, and they really set the rebels on their heels. They reinvigorated the Syrian army. The rebels were falling back on every front. What did we do? We released thousands of anti-tank missiles. And we released them to the moderate rebels, the people that you saw standing on the backs of women, parading people around in cages, the moderates. We gave them the TOW anti-tank missiles. They give them in turn to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS. ISIS, all of their anti-tank missiles come from the United States, some from France, but most of them from the United States. All of the Al-Qaeda anti-tank missiles, if it were not for that, the war would be over and Syria would be at peace today. Next, we need to reopen the Syrian embassy, which we closed on the verge of the Syrian elections, the presidential elections. What was happening is Bashar al-Assad was so popular with the people that we knew that if we allowed expatriates to vote at the American embassy, that he'd get a tremendous victory in the United States. And so that was the point at which we closed the embassy. We need to reopen the Syrian embassy. And then I would hope that the next president of the United States issues an extremely explicit executive order that forbids the CIA or State Department from taking any actions against Syria and makes it a personal penalty. Any individual who cooperates in doing so is fired. No question, that's it. And it doesn't matter whether you were ordered, the order is an illegal order and you better disobey that illegal order or you're losing your pension and you're gone. The other thing is we need to forbid aid of any type to any rebels in Syria. I'll close with this. When I was visiting with the Patriarch, this very nice school, this is a group of Christian students. And if you would just simply look at the faces of those children and recognize that if Syria does not prevail over ISIS in this war, 2/3 of those children will be dead within a couple of years. They'll be slaughtered. Christians, the Alawites, Druze, Shiites, the moderate Sunnis, there's going to be a vast bloodbath. And these are the people that I fight for, not the Christians so much, but simply Syrians who I know will die. And this is why I have such passion about it and why I spend so much time, because my country is better. And I'll close with this final thing. When I was when I was a young Marine recruit, I started off as a private at Paris Island. And at night, the drill instructor would line us up and we would stand at attention and we would yell out the Marine Corps hymn. And it has a line and it says, "We will fight for right and freedom and to keep our honor clean." We're proud to claim the title of United States Marine. Our honor is not clean. We have never engaged in a more filthy and despicable action than our covert war on Syria. It must end, because if it does not, then all of civilization is at risk. And with that, I thank you for your patience. I know this is a bit long, but
we enjoy it.
Thank you.